Welcome back to Bark Bites Comics. I'm your host, Jasper Bark, but you can call me dear old Uncle Jasper. In the comments section of our last show, I asked you for your suggestions on which classic horror comic series I should cover in these shows. An overwhelming number of you suggested Swamp Thing, which is actually a superb suggestion because it's hard to overstate just how big an impact Swamp Thing has had, not just on horror comics or American horror comics, but comics in general over the last 50 years. Such a big impact, in fact, that it's going to take me not one, but 3 shows to properly do this series justice. So, in the first episode, this one, I'm going to be looking at the origins of Swamp Thing and muck monsters in general. In the second episode, I'm going to be looking at the groundbreaking run of British writer Alan Moore on Swamp Thing in the early to mid 80s. And finally, in the third episode, I'm going to be looking at other significant comic creator teams that have worked on Swamp Thing since then. So, buckle up, it's going to be a wild ride. Where does it all start? Well, as far as we're aware, the first fictional appearance of a swamp monster was in the short story It. Not the famous novel by Stephen King, this story was written in 1940 by a writer called Theodore Sturgeon, who was famous for writing horror, fantasy, but mainly science fiction. The story appeared in a now little known pulp called Unknown Worlds that in its day, in the late 30s and early 40s, rivaled Weird Tales for popularity. It was edited by the science fiction editor and author John W. Campbell, and he demanded only the highest standards from his writers, and it certainly shows in it. The story introduces us to a strange vegetable monster made out of muck and weeds that murders first a rabbit, then a dog, then a hunter, then goes on to terrorise a family of farmers before traumatising a 9-year-old girl, and then it's done away with its nemesis, which is, of all things, simply running water. I guess a creature that's created in a bog of stagnant water would fall prey to running water. In an aside, we later learn that the muck monster became a series of intelligent vegetation that attached itself to the ancient skeleton of a backwoodsman called Roger Kirk. No more explanation is given than this, and in fact I don't think we need any. The story is strangely atmospheric and incredibly haunting, and it had a huge impact on the field. No less a writer than Ray Bradbury praised it as one of his favourite horror stories, and Roy Thomas, who would go on to become the number 2 at Marvel Comics under Stan Lee, was hugely affected by the story when he read it as a child. In fact, he went on in 1971 to adapt the story for Marvel Comics. This wasn't the first appearance of a muck monster in comics though. Who was the first muck monster? Well, that would be the Heap, who first appeared in 1943 in a Hillman Comics publication called Airboy. Airboy told the stories of daring World War I and World War II airfighters who battled Nazis in the skies. The Heap first appeared as a villain in a backup strip called Skywolf. Skywolf was all about a daring airfighter pilot who went into battle wearing a giant wolf's head on his head as his helmet. In this story, we're introduced to Baron von Emmelmann, a noted German fighter pilot whose biplane crashes into a swamp in Poland. Von Emmelmann's will to live is so great that he refuses to die just because he's gone up in flames and drowned, and he draws all of the swamp's vegetative goodness or badness to him and is resurrected as the monster the Heap, who's sort of a cross between a muck monster, a yeti, a werewolf and a vampire because he drinks blood. The Heap was so popular in this strip that he came back time and again to battle Skywolf, and proved to be so popular that he eventually beat Skywolf and replaced him as the backup strip in Airboy. He went on to be even more popular to the degree that the Heap began to replace Airboy on the cover of his own comic. The series really reaches a creative peak when the creative team of Ed Cronin, editor, and Ernest Schroeder, artist, begin to work on it. This pairing introduced a huge amount of mythology into the Heap's background, including the introduction of the Roman goddess of fertility, Ceres, into the series. Try saying that when you're drunk. Ceres into the series. Anyway, the Heap continues to go from strength to strength until 1953, when waning sales and also a huge moral backlash building against horror comics caused Hillman Publications to shut up shop. But, like all great monsters, the Heap wasn't done, and he was resurrected 18 years later in 1971 for a short run in the Skyward series of black and white horror comics, Psycho and Nightmare. He only had a short life there because by 1975 declining sales had put an end to Skyward's brilliant reign of black and white horror comics. But he was going to come back. A mere 11 years later, in 1986, in issue 3 of Eclipse's newly revamped Airboy comic. By this point, however, he wasn't the most famous swamp monster on the scene. There were a few more contenders for that title. What about Swamp Thing? Swamp Thing first appeared in an 8-page story in DC's mystery title House of Secrets. In the 60s and 70s, the Comics Code Authority forbade any comics publishers from publishing horror comics. So DC had to publish its horror comics under very tight strictures, and it had to call them mystery titles, leaning very much into the Gothic side of comics and the horror genre. House of Secrets 92 includes a story called Swamp Thing, written by Len Wein and drawn by the amazing Bernie Wrightson. The story is all about a bizarre love triangle that takes place in the Victorian era. The love triangle involves Alex Olson, a scientist, his research assistant Damien, and his fiancée Linda. Unfortunately, Damien can't stand the thought of his boss taking the woman that he loves. So he rigs Alex's laboratory to create an explosion, trying to get his rival out of the way. Unfortunately for Damien, the explosion doesn't kill Alex. It just leaves him half dead. So he drags the half-lifeless corpse into the swamp and buries it, and then goes on to marry Linda. This would have been a happily ever after for Damien if not for the fact that Alex comes back as a shambling swamp monster who has nothing better to do than to stalk his ex-fiancée. This is very fortuitous for Linda because she's begun to suspect that perhaps Alex's death wasn't accidental. Realising this, Damien decides to poison her with a poisonous injection. Before he can do this, Alex, as the muck monster, bursts into the house and throttles his rival. Unfortunately, Linda doesn't quite see it this way. She doesn't see her old fiancé coming back to rescue her. She sees a hideous muck monster burst in and murder her husband. So she recoils in horror from Alex and runs away. At which point, Alex realises that he is never going to be with the love of his life. So he shuffles off, sadly, back into the swamp where he belongs, leaving us all with a huge lump in our throat. This story was incredibly successful in its day, and it more or less birthed an entire legend. What happened next? House of Secrets 92 was DC's best-selling title of that month, outselling bestsellers like Superman and Batman. Publisher Carmine Infantino and editor Joe Orlando realised they had a hit on their hands and very quickly commissioned a series starring the Swamp Thing. Unfortunately, round about the same time that the book came out, Bernie Wrightson left New York to go back to his hometown of Baltimore. This was in the days before either the internet or mobile phones, so he had no idea of the huge success of this 8-page strip, and nobody could reach him to tell him. By the time he got back to New York, people were frantically looking for him and trying to track him down. Unfortunately, when he got together with Len Wein and to work out what they were going to do with their series, both of them had hit a creative block. The 8-page comic had been something of a creative high point for both of the creators, and they weren't sure how on earth they were going to follow it. In fact, the block lasted about a year until it suddenly struck Len Wein that what they would have to do is retell the Swamp Thing's origins, but set it in a modern day setting. So that's why it took nearly a year and a half from its first record-breaking publication in House of Secrets for Swamp Thing to finally start in his own series. But when he did, it was well worth the wait. So how good was the series? Well, in all honesty, the first 10 issues are a high point for 1970s comics. The opening issue tells the story of the scientists, no longer Alex Olson, but Alex Holland, who has moved to a swamp in Louisiana to work on a bio-restorative formula that will allow plants to grow in the most arid and inhospitable environments, thereby solving world hunger. Unfortunately for Alex, this goes against the invested interests of a large criminal corporation called the Conclave, and they send their goons out to do away with Alex. The goons plant a bomb in Alex's laboratory, and when it explodes, Alex runs his entire body covered in flames into the swamp and perishes in the swamp water. But the biorestorative formula starts to work on his body and transforms him into the swamp monster we all know and love, Swamp Thing. When the Conclave sends its goons back to the swamp to tie up any loose ends, namely his wife, Linda, Swamp Thing comes to her rescue. In subsequent issues, he would go on to fight a whole series of villains and monsters. Most notable amongst them was his arch nemesis, Anton Arcane, a mad scientist with an army of unmen, which were strange synthesized mutant anthropoids that he would loose upon the Swamp Thing. Arcane is desperate to find the secret of immortal life, and he thinks that Alex, or rather the Swamp Thing, might just be the key to that secret. As well as Arcane, several members of his family also appeared in the strip. There was Grigori Arcane, whose body was blown apart by a landmine and then stitched back together to make the Frankenstein-like monster of the Patchwork Man. There was also Arcane's niece, Abigail, who would become something of a love interest for the Swamp Thing, a relationship that would be picked up on by subsequent writers to incredible effect later on in this series, and also most notably in revamps of the series. As well as Arcane, the Swamp Thing also faced werewolves, he faced witches, he faced a strange village of clockwork androids, and a Lovecraftian deity called Nagala, and even, not quite a monster, more of a hero, Batman. What makes it so good? Well, part of the magic formula was the love that the creators had for the subject matter. The artist, Bernie Wrightson, grew up in the 1950s as a monster kid, one of those kids who grew up watching the old black and white horror movies on television and reading magazines like Famous Monsters of Filmland. He had a real feel for this subject matter, and Len Wein lent into this, taking the Gothic tropes of the 30s and 40s and reframing them in a very contemporary 1970s fashion. Not only that, but Wrightson's work was really coming into its own. His style synthesizes the very best of the old EC horror comic artists like Jack Davis, particularly Graham Ghastly Ingalls, and also Wally Wood. But it gives it a very 1970s feel, and he also incorporated the more experimental elements of his European contemporaries. So every page of this particular comic, of those first 10 issues, absolutely sings. But also we have to take into account the way that each of those first 10 comics were created. It was a hugely collaborative effort. The writer Len Wein and the artist Bernie Wrightson would go into editor Joe Orlando's office and thrash out each issue as a team. Len Wein would come up with story ideas, bouncing them off Joe Orlando, who would make suggestions on the fly, and Bernie Wrightson would sit there with a huge pad sketching out thumbnails for each individual page. When they had the story thrashed out to their satisfaction, Wrightson would take the thumbnails away and draw them up into finished pencils. When he'd done the pencils, he would pass these to Wein. Wein would then write the captions and the dialogue for each page and send it back to Wrightson to ink. When Wrightson had finished inking it, Joe Orlando would do the final finishing touches as an editor, get it coloured and get it printed. And this is why each issue of those first 10 issues is so strong, because each individual collaborator in this process brought out the very best in each other, creating something that none of them could have created by themselves individually. Why did Bernie Wrightson leave? Well, truthfully, he was burnt out. Wrightson is a visionary artist who pours everything he has onto the page. And after 10 issues and nearly 2 years working on this character, he pretty much said everything he wanted to say about monsters, and particularly about swamp monsters. In addition to this, he was offered much better paying work at Warren's line of black and white comics. So, with some regret, he left the book. DC, however, had a hit on its hands and wasn't keen to cancel the series just because its star artist has left. They kept Len Wein on as writer, and they replaced Bernie Wrightson with the Filipino artist Nestor Redondo. Now, Nestor Redondo is one of the most undersung, underappreciated artists of the 70s and early 80s. His work is absolutely beautiful. It's meticulous and highly detailed, and it's very, very realistic. Unfortunately, as brilliant as it is, it doesn't lend itself as well as Wrightson's work to the kind of off-the-wall stories that Swamp Thing was telling. In addition to this, Len Wein had moved from a very collaborative way of creating stories to writing full scripts to send off to Redondo, who lived thousands of miles away. When this creative and collaborative process was taken away from Wein, I think it took away a certain amount of his inspiration as well. He wasn't sparking off his creative teammates in the same way, and his stories become a little bit lackluster. That's why he left the comic by issue 13. He was replaced by a new young writer called David Michelinie. David Michelinie would go on to create some amazing comics both for DC and for Marvel. He's the guy that turned Iron Man into an alcoholic. That's right, he's the writer who drove Tony Stark to drink. However, working on the Swamp Thing, he was never able to lift the series back to the heights that it had previously held. He limped on, but as his run continued up to issue 24, it began to hemorrhage readers, and by the time he left and was replaced by Jerry Conway, sales were plummeting. Although in issue 25 was advertised, it never hit the stands, and DC cancelled the book in issue 24. However, as we've already established, swamp monsters don't stay dead for very long. And in 1982, the excellent director Wes Craven decided to do a movie based on this property. With a blockbusting movie coming out in theatres all over the States, DC saw huge dollar signs, so they resurrected the title once again, this time calling it Saga of the Swamp Thing. And this they also, once again, put Len Wein in charge of the Swamp Thing, but not as a writer this time, but as the editor of the series. The writer for the first 19 issues was Marty Pasco. Marty Pasco did an okay job, but he was just beginning a career in television, and I think his attention was elsewhere. He left with book 19, and In an unprecedented and an incredibly inspired move, Len Wein offered the book to a then completely unknown British writer called Alan Moore. Nobody could have guessed at the heights to which Moore was going to take the book over the next 3-4 years. However, that is another story for another episode. What's my current horror comic recommendation for this show? Well, I think you should all be reading World Tree by the artist Fernando Blanco and the writer James Tynion IV, who's responsible for such modern classics as Nice House on the Lake, Something is Killing the Children, and Department of Truth. World Tree tells the story of a series of computer geek misfits led by a guy called Gabriel, who as teens discover there is a secret hidden architecture underneath the internet called the Undernet, and something incredibly dangerous and highly malevolent is growing there. As teens, they're able to cut off the Undernet from access to the rest of the world and vanquish the terror that they faced. Unfortunately, like all great monsters in horror comics, the vanquishing was only temporary. Now the threat is back and it's more dangerous than ever. And the only people who can stop it, of course, are Gabriel and his misfits. So far, at the time of recording, there are currently 2 volumes out in this series, collecting the first 10 issues. I do know that in October they're going to publish a 3rd volume, collecting the next 5. I suggest you make your way down to your favourite comics pusher and buy as many volumes as you can lay your hands on. I can promise you, you will not be sorry. And now, the news. My first piece of news is about the Tripwire From the Archives Volume 1 Kickstarter. Tripwire is the UK's longest running magazine and website covering comic news and comic related matters. They've been going for over 3 decades now, and the From the Archives project is a collection of their most interesting and enlightening interviews with the top creators from the past 3 decades. We'll leave a link down in the comments section for you to click on and back this Kickstarter, because you really should. My other piece of news concerns Black Forests from Scratch Comics. Scratch Comics are a leading British independent comics publisher run by Shane Chebsey, and Black Forests is an anthology of 6 stories, all written by the scribe Peter Hogan. If you don't know the name Peter Hogan, you probably do know the name of his most famous creation, the comic Resident Alien, written by him and drawn by Steve Parkhouse, that has become an incredibly successful series on Netflix. This anthology at the time of recording is just about to hit the comic shelves, so make your way down to your favourite comic shop and buy a copy now. Trust your Uncle Jasper on this. You know it makes sense. Guys, I have a bit of a postscript to this episode. As I was researching Swamp Thing, I went back to the original run of Swamp Thing comics that I collected when I was a callow youth about 30 years ago, working in a comic shop in Notting Hill. I took them out of their Millar bags for perhaps the first time in goodness knows how many decades, and I discovered something when I opened my copy of Swamp Thing issue number 1. What I had never realised before, and perhaps because I've never actually opened this because I've always had reading copies, which I've now gotten rid of, is this first issue was in fact signed by none other than the artist Bernie Wrightson. I had no idea until a few hours ago when I opened this. How about that for a lucky find? Welcome back to Bark Bites Comics. I'm your host, Jasper Bark, and this is the second in our 3-part series about the legendary horror comics character Swamp Thing. If you didn't see the first episode, don't worry, but if you like this one, please go back and check it out. This show, we're going to be looking at Alan Moore's groundbreaking run on Saga of the Swamp Thing. But before we get to that, I would be very grateful if you would go below, find that like button and that subscribe button and smack those little babies like they were the last 2 flies on the wall of your favourite orgy. Because it really does help not only this show, but the House of Shadows and Ink channel. And now, back to Alan Moore. Who was Alan Moore before Swamp Thing? Alan Moore was a lesser-known British writer who'd begun life in the late 1970s as a cartoonist, doing strips for the British music magazine Sounds and his local newspaper. By the beginning of the 80s, he had graduated to writing backup strips for Doctor Who Weekly and 2000 AD. His work soon became popular enough with readers that he was given the writing chores for Captain Britain at Marvel UK, Halo Jones at 2000 AD, and Marvel Man, later to be Miracle Man, and V for Vendetta at the British black and white comic magazine Warrior. Warrior was published by a hustler called Des Skin, who soon recognised that the high quality of the strips he was publishing were very, very valuable. This meant the way to go, he thought, was to license the work he'd already published to the American market and the European market. So, Des, at the beginning of the 80s, spent a lot of time doing the rounds of the American publishers, showing them the work that he published in Warrior. Eventually, he came to the DC offices, and that's how Alan Moore's work fell into the lap of the editor of Swamp Thing, Len Wein. Len was immediately struck with the high quality of Alan Moore's writing on Miracle Man and V for Vendetta. At the same time, he was a little bit concerned about his friend Marty Pascoe, who was then writing Saga of the Swamp Thing for him. He thought Marty was stretched a little thin with all his writing work, and also sales were not good on the title, and he knew he needed to replace Marty. As soon as he read Alan Moore's work, Len knew he'd found his replacement. So, the very next day, he phoned up Alan Moore first thing in the morning. Now, first thing in the morning in the States is round about tea time, as we call it here in the UK. So Alan Moore answered the phone with a mouthful of cake to hear a guy with an American accent ask him if he'd like to write Swamp Thing. Now, in those days, in the very early 80s, almost no British comics writers worked in American comics. It was pretty unheard of. So Alan thought this was one of his friends phoning him up to wind him up, and he very nearly told Len Wein to F off. Luckily, he didn't, and he soon realised that the offer was in earnest. He, of course, because this was a huge opportunity for him, accepted the gig on the spot. And that's how he came to join Swamp Thing with issue number 20, a move that would go on to revolutionise American comics, horror comics, and in fact comics across the world forever. Was it all down to Alan Moore? Oh, hell no. The artistic team were already in place on the book when Alan Moore began writing it. Steve Bissett, John Totleben and Rick Veitch all met at the Joe Kubert School of Comic Art. In fact, Bissett and Veitch met on the very first day and became best friends for life, helped in no small part by the fact that Bissett was already a fan of the underground comic work that Rick Veitch had done before joining the school. They soon became really good friends with John Totleben and another artist called Tom Yates. The four became a unit, and when they graduated from the Joe Kubert School for Comic Arts, they moved into a house cum studio together that they dubbed the House of the Dutch Masters. Of the four, the first artist to get regular paid professional work was Tom Yates, and his first gig was the Saga of the Swamp Thing, illustrating Marty Pascoe's work. After about 8 issues, the relentless and grinding deadlines were beginning to wear Tom Yates down. He was beginning to fall a little bit behind. So he turned to his 3 friends from the Joe Kubert School to help him out. He just needed somebody to come in and fill in backgrounds for him, help him out with panel composition, and ink or pencil the odd page for him. In return for that, he would pay Steve, John and Rick $50 a day. This was quite a common practice back in those days and still is to this day. This meant that all three artists were already very well acquainted with the Swamp Thing universe by the time issue 13 came around, and Tom Yates decided that he'd had enough. He recommended that Steve Bissett and John Totterman try out for the gig as his replacement. So they roughed up some sample pages for editor Len Wein, with Steve Bissett penciling some and John Totterman inking, and John Totterman penciling some and Steve Bissett inking. They soon came to the conclusion that Steve Bissett was a much more natural storyteller and had a much better grasp of layout, whereas John Totterman was much better on the finer details and was more suited to being an inker. Len Wein agreed, and he hired both artists to work together on the book from issue 16. They didn't actually draw as a team Alan Moore's first script. That was issue 20. Where he was simply tying up all the loose ends of Marty Pascoe's run. That was drawn by, or rather penciled by, Dan Day and significantly redrawn by John Totterman when he inked it. The book that Bissett and Veitch and Totterman came together to draw was issue 21, The Anatomy Lesson. The comic that perhaps single-handedly changed the entire course of horror comics forever. Is Anatomy Lesson as good as you've heard? It's better. As soon as he got the script for issue 21, Steve Bissett was absolutely blown away. He became convinced that it was the single best comic script he'd ever read in his life, and he immediately showed it to John and Rick, and in fact anybody who would sit still long enough to read it. The Anatomy Lesson tells the story of what happens to Swamp Thing after he's gunned down in the swamp by General Sunderland's forces at the end of issue 20. General Sunderland has Swamp Thing's body cryogenically frozen and flown to his headquarters in New York in a large computer-controlled corporate skyscraper. Sunderland then has Dr. Jason Woodrue, who's better known as the supervillain the Floronic Man, released from prison so he can dissect Swamp Thing's body and learn its secrets, because Woodrue is the world's leading authority on intelligent vegetables. Woodrue begins work dissecting the Swamp Thing's body, but he soon comes to learn that all of the organs in the body, the heart and the lungs, are simple lumps of vegetable matter that don't work as organs. In fact, even his wooden skeleton is completely inoperable. This leads Woodrue to form an absolutely revolutionary theory. This theory is based on an actual experiment where scientists took a group of planarian worms and they taught them to go through a maze. As soon as the planarian worms had successfully learned how to navigate the maze, they were ground up and fed to other planarian worms that hadn't gone through the maze. Because science. Anyway, what the scientists discovered was that the planarian worms that couldn't do the maze could actually complete the maze as soon as they'd eaten their brethren who had been trained to go through the maze without any training whatsoever at all. This led the scientists to come to the conclusion that intelligence and memories can be ingested and absorbed by organic matter. Woodrue tells Sunderland this is what has happened in the case of the Swamp Thing. When Alec Holland fell into the waters of the swamp, he wasn't transformed into Swamp Thing. What actually happened was the vegetable matter that was really dense in the swamp absorbed the intelligence and memories of Alec Holland and then formed itself into a rough approximation of his body. So what he's saying effectively is that Swamp Thing isn't a man who's been turned into a vegetable monster. He is a vegetable which still thinks of itself as a man. Sunderland is blown away by Woodrue's theory, but He always intended to double cross him and send him back to prison so he could profit from Woodrew's findings. Anticipating this, Woodrew sabotages the cryogenic freezer where Swamp Thing's body is kept, knowing that Swamp Thing isn't in fact dead, he's just in shock, and as soon as his body thaws out, it will regrow itself. Swamp Thing climbs out of the cryogenic freezer and then reads Woodrew's report, and the truth of his condition is revealed to him. This has an absolutely catastrophic effect on Swamp Thing's psyche, and in a murderous rage, he kills General Sunderland and returns to the swamp. In one 23-page story, Alan Moore completely reframes the entire concept of the Swamp Thing saga. Swamp Thing is no longer a man in search of his humanity. He has in fact become an earth elemental. Following this issue, Swamp Thing would go on to face off against the Pharaonic Man and to thwart his plans to take over the world. Next, he would come up against Jack Kirby's character, the demon Etrigan, and he would come face to face with Etrigan in, of all things, a school for severely autistic children. After these two runs, we get to another landmark issue. Issue 29's Love and Death. Is Love and Death an important story? Very. To this day, it remains one of the most visceral and disturbing horror comics ever produced. In fact, it was so disturbing that the Comics Code Authority refused to allow it to be published without significant changes. The creative team, Alan Moore, Steve and John, positively refused to change a single line in the whole story. And this prompted Karen Berger, who'd taken over the editorial reins from Len Wein, to make the decision to put out Saga of the Swamp Thing without the Comics Code Authority seal of approval on it. This one single act helped to launch the adult-oriented, creator-owned comics revolution that soon birthed the Vertigo line. That's right, without this one story, it could be argued that there would have been no Vertigo, which meant there would have been no Hellblazer, no Sandman, no Preacher, no Fables, no Invisibles. That is how important this one single comic is. It features corpses which have been reanimated by demonically possessed insects that are infesting their flesh. These corpses have been reanimated by Swamp Thing's old arch nemesis Anton Arcane, who now resides in Hell. He has taken over these corpses so he can capture his niece Abigail, whom he has been molesting since she was a child, and drag her physically down to Hell to be his plaything. Swamp Thing, upon learning this, decides, like Odysseus in the underworld, to use his newfound powers as an earth elemental to travel to the afterlife to rescue Abby. Along the way, he's helped by a series of supernatural characters from the DC universe that at that point had gone completely out of print, like the Dead Man, like the Phantom Stranger, and like the Spectre. Following this story, all those characters would go on to have their own titles, helped in no small part probably by the success of this story. Anyway, Swamp Thing is successful in freeing Abby from Arcane's clutches, and the two leave Hell and then eventually become lovers. Did they really have vegetable sex? Yes, and it inspired the plot for the movie Swamp Thing 2. The idea began to take shape a little before Alan Moore came on the book as a writer, when Steve, John and Rick went to a party at the artist Tim Truman's house. They had a little bit too much to drink and probably took some other substances and started to think about wild ideas they'd like to see in the Swamp Thing strip. One of the ideas that Rick Veitch came up with was the idea that perhaps Swamp Thing's body could start to grow tubers out of it that humans could actually eat. And John Tottleman suggested that these tubers would be hallucinogenic. When Alan Moore came on as a writer, he's a very collaborative individual, and he asked John and Steve if there were any ideas that they'd like to see in the strip. So they sat down and wrote him out a list of all these wild ideas they'd had, including the edible hallucinogenic tubers. Alan Moore thought this idea was positively diseased, and he filed it away for future use. After the Love and Death storyline, when Abby and Swamp Thing became lovers, Steve Bissett wrote to Alan and said, "Isn't it a bit strange that we can't actually show them as physical lovers, that we can't do a love story between an earth elemental and a human being?" And Alan Moore sat down and began to think about how a human being would actually be physically intimate with an earth elemental. That's when he remembered the idea for the hallucinogenic tubers and thought, well, perhaps the human being would have to ingest a part of Swamp Thing, and this part would of course be one of the tubers that grows on his body. And so he sat down and he wrote Rites of Spring, which is an absolutely wild, psychedelic, erotic romp where Abby becomes physically intimate with Swamp Thing, and it's a mind-expanding, transcendent experience. Nothing like this had ever been seen in horror comics or even comics before, and it totally changed the landscape of what was possible in a mainstream comic. But this wasn't the only wild idea that Alan Moore was exploring at this time. He began to lean into the idea of Swamp Thing being an earth elemental and began to wonder if Swamp Thing even needed to stay in one body. Perhaps he could leave one body and regrow another body in a different part of the swamp. Not only a different part of the swamp, but perhaps a different part of the world. In fact, anywhere on the planet where plants grew, Swamp Thing could probably grow himself a body through travelling through a psychic space which connects all plant life, known as the green. He was totally reframing, changing and revolutionising the entire concept of this character. Didn't John Constantine first appear in this run? Yes. Among the many ideas that John and Steve sent to Alan when they first began working together on the comic was a request to include a character that looked just like Sting. I guess John and Steve really liked drawing Sting. At the same time, Alan wanted to do a series of stories that reinvented the classic horror comic tropes. In order to do this, he hit upon the idea of introducing a character that was part conman and part chaos magician, who would lead Swamp Thing across the United States to face off against a series of supernatural threats, always remaining one step ahead of him. And so, John Constantine, Man of Mystery, was born. The whole series came to a head with a grand finale wherein Swamp Thing worked together with John Constantine to stop the coming of Armageddon. Now you might think with such an explosive finale that Alan Moore would be done with Swamp Thing, but he still had a lot of stories to tell. Unfortunately, Steve and John didn't, and they quit the book. Who could possibly follow John and Steve? Step forward, Rick Veitch. As we've already established, Rick had been working behind the scenes on the book since issue 8, and along the way he'd drawn many fill-in issues. So he was the perfect person to take up the reins as the full-time artist with issue 51. During Rick's tenure, Abby would be arrested for crimes against nature because of her relationship with Swamp Thing. She was taken to Gotham City, where she was held and imprisoned, and this caused Swamp Thing to unleash his entire powers as an Earth Elemental upon the city of Gotham, so they would release his lover. And this brings Swamp Thing up against Batman, who discovers that Batman discovers that he cannot beat the Swamp Thing, so he suggests to the authorities that the love between a human and an Earth Elemental is perhaps not a crime against nature. Unfortunately though, Swamp Thing has totally scared the US government with this exertion of his powers, and they hire Lex Luthor, an expert in fighting metahumans, to take Swamp Thing out. Luthor develops a device that will cut Swamp Thing's soul off from the green, thereby stopping him from growing any more bodies. And they shoot down Swamp Thing's body, and Swamp Thing's spirit, Swamp Thing's soul, is exiled off the planet. He then begins another odyssey where he explores life on other planets and encounters all of the somewhat forgotten science fiction characters from the DC universe. Finally, in issue 63, he finds his way back to Earth in the issue Loose Ends Reprise, and he is reunited with Abby. This only leaves issue 64, Good Gumbo, to wrap up the whole series in what, for once for Alan Moore, is a happy ending. When Alan Moore began this book in 1983, he was a little-known British writer. By the time he finishes 4 years later in 1987, he is probably one of the single most famous comic writers in the world. Thanks in no small part to series like The Watchmen, which he wrote towards the end of his run on Swamp Thing, but the whole success with Watchmen would not have been possible. In fact, much of what has happened since in the world of horror comics would not have been possible without Alan Moore's work and Steve Bissett's work and John Totlebin's work and Rick Veitch's work on this seminal horror comic. Alan Moore bows out with issue 64, but Rick Veitch stays on, not only as the penciler of the book, but also as the writer. But that, as they say, is another story for another show. Thanks for watching. Welcome back to Bark Bites Comics. I'm your host, Jasper Bark, and this is the third and final show in our series on the legendary horror comics character Swamp Thing. We're going to be taking a look at the creative teams that made a significant contribution to the Swamp Thing mythos. But before we do, I would consider it a personal favour if you'd go below, find that like button and that subscribe button and hit them like they were a headshot on a brain-hungry zombie. Thanks in advance for that. And now, on to Rick Veitch. Could Rick Veitch follow Alan Moore on Swamp Thing? Well, to be honest with you, not a lot of people thought he could. In fact, most people expected him to be nowhere near as good as Alan Moore. And this lack of expectation, I believe, gave Veitch a certain license on this title. Because when no one expects anything of you, that's when you can catch them all unawares. And I believe that's what Veitch did with his run on Swamp Thing. It was better than anyone expected it would be. Up until this point, the main strength of the creative teams that had done really well on Swamp Thing had been their collaboration. The fact that the finished piece was greater than the sum of the parts of any individual contribution. Veitch's run was the first time we had a single artist's vision on the series, although it is worthwhile recognising the contributions of inker Alfred Alcala and colorist Titania Wood, whose run on Swamp Thing was longer than any other single creative team or individual. As Rick Veitch's storyline begins, the Parliament of Trees are concerned that they've lost the champion of the green, as Swamp Thing spent many months exiled away in space. This left a vacuum that they had to fill, so they set in motion a series of events that would create another Swamp Thing. Unfortunately, when Swamp Thing came back, this overturned all of their careful plans. Unfortunately, they had created an ethereal being, a sort of essence of the green, known as the Sprout. And the Sprout was looking for a new Swamp Thing body to inhabit. This created a huge dilemma for Swamp Thing, because Swamp Thing realised that if he didn't stop the sprout would go on trying to create new bodies for itself, and this would upset the subtle balance of the green. But the only way to stop the sprout was to kill it, which was something that Swamp Thing was reluctant to do. Then his partner Abigail Arcane came to his aid and suggested that Swamp Thing, because he couldn't find a solution, grow a bigger brain in order to deal with this knotty problem and cut through the Gordian knot of his dilemma. This is another of the ways in which Rick Veitch took the themes and ideas that were introduced by Alan Moore over the course of his run and took them to a whole new level. Alan, John and Steve had introduced the concept of mind-expanding substances. Rick Veitch went one step further by quite literally expanding Swamp Thing's mind and, in the process, expanding his consciousness. This, for me, is one of my favourite issues in the whole of Rick Veitch's run. In fact, it's probably one of my favourite issues in the whole of Swamp Thing, because I found Rick Veitch's portrayal of Swamp Thing growing his brain and growing his mind to be quite literally psychotropic. I could feel my consciousness expanding along with Swamp Thing's, and it was an exhilarating experience. Anyway, the solution that Swamp Thing hits upon in his newly enlightened phase is that the future of avatars of the green will be an animal-vegetable hybrid. And he means to go about this by using John Constantine, by possessing John Constantine in order to impregnate Abby with Swamp Thing and Abby's child to create a vessel for the sprout. And so the character of Tefe, Abby's and Swamp Thing's child, is born. The use of John Constantine in the storyline was another of the ways that Veitch picked up on the ideas that Moore introduced to the series and again ran with them. Up until this point, Moore's treatment of Constantine, a character that was so popular with readers, he'd just been given his own book in the run in the title Hellblazer, written by Moore's protege Jamie Delano. The way that Moore had portrayed this character up to this point had been as a man of mystery, somebody who's always one step ahead of all the other characters, who steps out of the shadows with the answer to their problem at just the right moment. Veitch took this element of Constantine's character and again expanded upon it, looking at the ways in which Constantine operates and how he hits upon all these solutions and how he stays one step ahead of all the other characters. And he managed to do this without ever taking away any of the mystery behind the character or any of its mystique. And in fact, his portrayal of Constantine is an early high point for the character. Unfortunately, after the crossover between the new Hellblazer title and Swamp Thing under Veitch's run, things started to go badly wrong for Rick Veitch. How did it all go wrong for Rick Veitch? Well, it all began with Invasion, which was a crossover event that ran across all of DC's titles in 1988-89. At this point, Rick Veitch had actually given up the art chores on Swamp Thing and was simply writing it. The effect that Invasion had on Swamp Thing was to exile him from his own time stream and send him travelling backwards in time through the green. The concept of using the green to travel through time was another idea that Alan Moore had introduced into the series but not really done anything with. So Rick picked this up and ran with it. In this storyline, Swamp Thing travels further and further back in time, meeting historical characters from the DC universe, like Jonah Hex and the Shining Knight. Unfortunately, this all came to a crashing halt with what should have been issue 88 of Veitch's run. In this issue, Veitch had suggested a story in which Swamp Thing actually meets Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane. In order to do a story like this, he had to get the agreement of the upper echelons of DC's management. So he showed the script and all of his story ideas not only to his editor Karen Berger, but also to the publisher Jeanette Kahn. As the story was being drawn by Michael Zulli, Rick Veitch drew a cover showing, for issue 88, showing Swamp Thing as the cross on which Christ is crucified. Not actually Christ on the cross, just the cross itself with the face of Swamp Thing on the top of it. This cover was seen by certain DC employees who considered themselves to be very devout Christians, and they went to Jeanette Kahn with their objections. Round about this time, the filmmaker Martin Scorsese had run into a lot of trouble with his film, The Last Temptation of Christ, which had caused a furore amongst evangelical Christians because of its depiction of Christ's temptation while he's on the cross being crucified. Because of the negative backlash that this film created, Jeanette Kahn panicked and completely nixed the whole story. With only 3 days to go, Karen Berger phoned up Rick Veitch and told him he'd have to come up with a whole new idea for the book. Veitch was very concerned about this. He didn't feel he'd done anything wrong, and he tried everything he possibly could to save the story, promising to make any changes that they wanted. However, both Kahn and Berger had made up their minds and they were not going to allow this story to go ahead. And in fact, Veitch has said they made him feel like he was completely at fault and he'd done something utterly terrible and ruined the book and brought the name of DC into disrepute. So with a very heavy heart, he resigned from the book, and his last issue was issue 87. He was supposed to continue the storyline and then hand over the book to the writer Neil Gaiman, who at that point, Gaiman's star was rising very much at DC because of his success on the book Sandman. This is years and years and years before Gaiman was completely disgraced for his unacceptable behaviour. Gaiman and Veitch had apparently worked out an ending to the story that both writers thought was absolutely fabulous, and Gaiman was supposed to take over the writing chores once this storyline had finished. At that point, Gaiman was seen as something of an heir apparent to Alan Moore's crown at DC. This was due in no small part to the fact that he had been hand-chosen by Moore to take over the writing of one of Moore's flagship titles, that of Miracle Man. So it seemed at the time like he was the perfect person to use to continue writing Swamp Thing. He was also to have been joined in the writing of Swamp Thing by Jamie Delano, another of Moore's proteges, who at that point, as we've already said, was writing Hellblazer. Unfortunately, because of the circumstances under which Rick Veitch left the book, neither Gaiman nor Delano felt that they could in all good conscience carry on writing it. So they also resigned, leaving Karen Berger to scrabble about for a writer to continue the series. She eventually hit upon Doug Wheeler, but actually nobody has anything particularly excited or praiseworthy to say about his run on the title. Wheeler was eventually replaced by the horror writer Nancy Collins, whose most famous character is the vampire detective Sonia Blue. Collins returned the book to its roots and also set about creating something of a domestic drama, focusing on the relationship between Abby and Swamp Thing and their newborn daughter, Tefe, as well as concentrating on that very domestic setup. Collins also reintroduced Anton Arcane as the villain of the piece and brought back the Sunderland Corporation. She also created a character called Lady Jane to be a nanny to Tefe. And as nannies sometimes do, Lady Jane ends up having an affair behind Abigail's back with Swamp Thing. This eventually brings about the end of Abigail and Swamp Thing's relationship, and Abigail leaves both her daughter and Swamp Thing for another man. So at the end of her run, Nancy Collins undoes the whole status quo that she'd restored at the beginning of it. However, this was nothing compared to the seismic changes that the next creative team were about to bring to this book. And who would that creative team be? That would be writer Grant Morrison, his then protege Mark Millar, artist Philip Hester, and inker Kim de Mulder. At the time that Morrison took over the book, this would be 1994, and with issue 140, the well-publicised rivalry between Grant Morrison and Alan Moore was coming to a head. So for Morrison to take over the book that had made Moore famous probably seemed like a bit of a coup. However, Grant Morrison would only stay on the book for 4 titles before he left, because, as he claimed later in interview, DC wouldn't allow him to turn Swamp Thing into a Dadaist manifesto. However, the 4 issues that he did write in conjunction with Mark Millar are something of a high point for the book. They are creepy as hell, and they were so controversial at the time that the DC offices received a record amount of mail. In the storyline, the Parliament of Trees have become so tired of Swamp Thing constantly defying them that they split his human-like consciousness apart from his vegetable body, effectively creating 2 independent selves. The human-like self thinks it is Alec Holland once again, only this time Alec Holland believes himself to be an ethnobotanist living in the Amazonian rainforests in Peru, studying the psychedelic substances used by the local shamans. While he's taking these psychedelic substances, he has a series of hallucinations wherein he believes at one point he was actually an earth elemental. However, he keeps having flashbacks where he realizes that the vegetable body that was this earth elemental is now rampaging murderously through the swamps in Louisiana. And he realizes he has to make his way back to Louisiana to reunite with the Swamp Thing. And the only way he can do this is through a spectral means of transport known as the Soul Train. And he's guided in this endeavour by 3 shady characters known as the Fates. Inevitably, Alec Holland does reunite with the Swamp Thing and stop its murderous spree, but this is only the first in a series of trials that Swamp Thing will have to undergo. At this point, Grant Morrison bows out and Mark Millar takes over the full writing chores. Millar at this point was only 24 years old, and in fact his collaborator Philip Hester, the artist, was only 2 years older at 26. Unfortunately, in later years in interviews, Hester has said that he wishes he could go back and fix his art on Swamp Thing, or at least redraw some of it, because he believes he's become a much better artist. I think he's being a little bit too hard on himself, because I love his work on this series. His strange angular depiction of characters and his ultra scratchy lines, embellished and elevated by Kim de Mulder, who as an inker has made probably the single most significant contribution to this run on Swamp Thing since John Tottleman, are absolutely perfect for the horrific and terrifying story that Millar was telling. Millar's storyline concerns itself with the question of, if there is a Parliament of Trees, are there any other elemental parliaments operating on Earth? As it turns out, there are. There is the Parliament of Stones, the Parliament of Waves, the Parliament of Vapours, and the Parliament of Flames. And Swamp Thing finds himself in a series of predicaments where he has to come face to face with the champion of these specific and individual elemental parliaments in a death match, which will see him either die or take on the powers and responsibilities of each one of those individual parliaments. In each of these trials, he is guided by the three fates. But as it turns out, these fates have a sinister agenda. They want Swamp Thing to take over all the different parliaments to become the individual avatar of the Earth itself, so that Swamp Thing can destroy all life on Earth and begin over, and in order to save the planet. This apocalyptic quest comes to a head with issue 71, and the way that Millar resolves this storyline is, quite frankly, absolutely brilliant and totally unexpected, and it ties up a run that changed Swamp Thing almost as much as Alan Moore's absolutely groundbreaking run did. I won't tell you how he resolves it because that would spoil it for you, and I hope you will go and search out the trades. Although I will say that Swamp Thing doesn't bring about the end of the world. Unfortunately though, this last issue, issue 171, did bring about the end of this run for Swamp Thing. Was that the end for Swamp Thing? Well, no. There would actually be 5 more series following this. In 2000, Vertigo relaunched Swamp Thing under the auspices of writer Brian K. Vaughan, who is probably best known for writing Saga and Why the Last Man. Beginning in 2000, Brian wrote a series that concentrated not on Swamp Thing, but on Swamp Thing and Abby's daughter, Tefe, in a 20-part series that was extremely well received. Then in 2004, Vertigo relaunched the book once again, this time written by Andy Diggle, Will Pfeiffer and Joshua Dysart, and that series lasted for another 29 issues. However, it is the creative team on the 5th series that I'd like to take a closer look at, because they once again rebooted the entire Swamp Thing universe. Who would have the balls to reboot Swamp Thing? Well, that would be the creative team of writer Scott Snyder and artist Yannick Paquette. Scott Snyder had become best known at this point, 2011, for writing the horror series American Vampire for Vertigo and for his highly acclaimed run on Batman. Yannick Paquette had drawn Justice League of America for DC Comics and Ultimate X-Men for Marvel. They rebooted Swamp Thing as part of DC's New 52. This was a company-wide initiative that rebooted every single character in the DC universe, wiping out decades of continuity and starting each character in their new #1 issue. In Swamp Thing's case, Alec Holland is brought back to life and approached by an avatar of the green. The Parliament of the Trees need Holland to accept the mantle of the Swamp Thing so he can see off the threat of the rot. Holland is completely unwilling to accede to their demands and turns them down flat, whereupon he is kidnapped by a motorcycle-riding, shotgun-wielding Abigail Arcane, who needs Holland's help and Holland's help alone in helping her save her half-brother, William Arcane, a terminal child cancer patient, from the clutches of the rot that wants to make William Arcane its avatar. The Rot is an innovation created by Snyder and Paquette that's set up to be probably the complete antithesis of the Green. Whereas the Green's purpose is to encourage all plant life to flourish and grow, the Rot's purpose is to encourage all life on the planet to decay and become corrupted. Ultimately, Alec and Abigail are unable to save William from the hands of the rot, but this does mean that Holland eventually gives in to the Parliament of the Trees and accepts the mantle he was born to bear, that of Swamp Thing. There then follows an epic 18-part storyline that sees Swamp Thing face off against the rot and all of its champions, which includes your favourite Swamp Thing villain and mine, Mr. Anton Arcane. The whole storyline culminates in Rot World, which is an epic post-apocalyptic drama that sees a crossover between the new Swamp Thing title and the new Animal Man title, then written by Jeff Lemire. I won't tell you how it all turns out, but like the rest of the run, it is a highly action-packed and also completely terrifying run. As well as introducing a lot more action and a lot more horror into the series, Snyder and Paquette brought about a lot of visual innovations to the Swamp Thing character as well, giving him a huge pair of wooden antlers like a stag and even the ability to fly. I think as well as adding action and horror, Snyder and Paquette probably brought more innovations and more new ideas to the Swamp Thing mythos than any previous creative team since Mark Millar and Philip Hester. And that's why I've chosen them to be the final creative team to take a deep dive into. I am aware that there are many creative teams who've worked on the character of Swamp Thing that have either glossed over in this examination or not mentioned at all. If by any chance I have failed to mention or concentrate on your favourite creative team, I would really like to hear from you. Please do leave a comment below telling me which team you think I ought to have included in these videos, and also your reasons for thinking that they deserve all of our time and attention. In the meantime, I would very strongly recommend you search out the collected editions of all of these runs because they are very much worth your time, trouble and money. Trust your Uncle Jasper on this. You know it makes sense.